The train hisses to a stop, a great iron beast sighing steam into the bone-dry air of redemption. Alara clutches her small, worn valise, her knuckles white. This is it, the end of a 1,000-mile journey and the start of everything. Through the dusty window, she sees him standing on the platform, just as his photograph described. A man of some import, stout and dressed in a tailored vest, his watch chain glinting in the aggressive afternoon sun. Mr. Abram Stallworth. Her future. Her heart hammers against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She takes a shallow breath, practicing the words in her mind one last time. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mr. Stallworth. Simple, polite. She can say it. She must. The conductor calls out the town's name, and she joins the handful of passengers disembarking onto the splintered planks of the platform. The heat is a physical blow. Dust coats her tongue instantly. She sees Mr. Stallworth scan the passengers, his gaze dismissing a family with too many children and a pair of rough-looking prospectors before it lands on her. He consults the photograph in his hand, then looks back at her, a flicker of appraisal in his eyes. He gives a curt, proprietary nod. She walks toward him, her worn boots making soft sounds in the thick dust. Her hands are sweating, and she tightens her grip on the valise handle. He stands waiting, not moving to help her, an expectant look on his face. He is shorter than his photograph suggested, and his mouth is a thin, severe line. Mr. Stallworth, she begins, her voice small. He clears his throat. You are Miss Alara Johnston? Why, Wes, the first word stumbles, catching on the rocks of her anxiety. She feels a flush of heat crawl up her neck, hotter than the sun. She wills the next words to come out smoothly, a desperate prayer sent to a silent heaven. It is a PP pleasure to FF finally. Oh, heavens. It's worse today. The travel, the nerves, the weight of his stare. The words are dammed up, pushing and jostling, unable to find a clear path. Mr. Stallworth's expression transforms. The polite, if cool, appraisal vanishes, replaced by a look of profound disbelief, which quickly curdles into disgust. He takes a half-step back, as if she were carrying a communicable disease. A few people nearby have stopped to watch the exchange, their curiosity piqued. What is this? He asks, his voice sharp and loud, meant not just for her, but for the audience he has now gathered. What is wrong with your tongue, girl? Humiliation, a familiar and venomous companion, floods her. It is just a SD stutter, sir. It's C comes and GG goes. A stutter, he scoffs, the sound like tearing cloth. You are defective. I sent for a wife, not a broken music box. He holds up her letter, the one she'd spent a week composing, each word carefully chosen, painstakingly written to conceal her impediment. This is a lie. Deception. You wrote a fine hand, but you cannot speak a plain sentence. The snickers start on the edge of the small crowd. A woman with a pinched face hides a smirk behind her gloved hand. A boy of about 10 mimics her, making garbled sounds until his mother swats him away, though she is smiling too. Alara feels herself shrinking, the vast, open sky of the west suddenly pressing down, suffocating her. The train whistle blows, a mournful cry signaling its departure. It begins to chug away, taking her last link to the world she knew, leaving her stranded in this crucible of shame. I will not have it, Stallworth declares, his voice booming with self-righteous indignation. I am a respected merchant in this town. I will not be saddled with this. He gestures at her, as if she were a lame horse he'd been tricked into buying. You can get on the next train back, wherever it is you came from. I'll not be responsible for you. He turns his back on her, a final, public dismissal, and stalks toward his general store across the street, leaving her utterly alone in a circle of staring, whispering strangers. Her valise slips from her numb fingers and lands with a soft thud in the dust. Her future, which had been a tiny, flickering candle of hope, has just been snuffed out. From the shade of the livery stable's overhang, a man pushes himself off a support beam he'd been leaning against. He is tall and lean, dressed in worn denims and a faded shirt, his face weathered by sun and wind. He'd watched the whole ugly scene unfold, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He had no stake in it, yet a coil of something cold and angry had tightened in his gut as he watched the storekeeper preen and posture, tearing down the terrified young woman for sport. Now, as she stands frozen in her own personal hell, he starts walking toward her, his strides slow and deliberate, his spurs leaving faint, rhythmic chinks in the oppressive silence. He is just a quiet cowboy, a man who prefers the company of horses to people, but even he knows that some lines shouldn't be crossed. And with 2 words, spoken in a voice low and steady, he changes everything. I will. Before we ride deeper into this Western tale, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments, and if you love a good old-fashioned story of the frontier, hit like and subscribe. The words were so quiet, Alara wasn't certain she'd heard them at all. They were a low rumble, a stark contrast to Stalwart's performative bellowing. She looked up, her vision blurred by unshed tears, and saw him. The cowboy. He had stopped a few feet from her, not crowding her, but creating a subtle barrier between her and the gawking townsfolk. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on Stalwart's retreating back. I will, he repeated a little louder this time, enough for the lingering spectators to hear. He shifted his gaze to Alara. There was no pity in his eyes, which was a mercy. There was just a stillness, a quiet assessment. I'll be responsible for her. A murmur went through the small crowd. Abram Stallworth, hearing the challenge, stopped and turned, his face flushed with fury. What business is it of yours, Silas? Have you taken to collecting strays? The cowboy, Silas, didn't rise to the bait. He simply bent down, his movements economical and unhurried, and picked up Alara's valise. He dusted it off with his hand and held it out to her. His hands were calloused and brown, the hands of a man who worked, not a man who counted coins. Ma'am, he said, the single word of question and an offer all in one. Alara stared at the valise, then at his face. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. His expression was one of profound neutrality, yet it felt safer than any smile she had ever received. She was trapped. She had no money for a ticket back east, even if she had the courage to face the shame of returning. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Here was a stranger offer. What? She didn't know. But it was something other than the raw, public humiliation she was currently enduring. Taking a shuddering breath, she reached out and took the valise from him. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt the rough texture of his skin, solid and real. Stallworth let out a contemptuous laugh. Fine. Have her, then. A stuttering bride for a dirt-poor rancher. It's almost poetic. He turned on his heel and disappeared into his store, the door jingling his triumph. The show was over. The townsfolk, deprived of their villain and their victim, began to disperse, casting curious, speculative glances at the odd pair left standing in the middle of the street. Silas paid them no mind. His focus was entirely on Alara. My wagon's over here, he said, his voice still low. He gestured with his head toward the livery. He didn't wait for an answer, simply started walking, assuming she would follow. It wasn't arrogance, she realized. It was a simple, practical expectation. He had made a decision, and this was the next logical step. Numbly, she followed him, her boots sinking into the dust that seemed to swallow all sound. She felt like a ghost, disconnected from her own body, watching a scene unfold from a great distance. He led her to a simple buckboard wagon hitched to a sturdy-looking mule. The wagon bed was filled with sacks of flour, beans, and other supplies. He tossed her valise into the back with a casualness that was somehow reassuring, then turned to help her up. He put his hands on her waist, and for a terrifying second, she flinched, the memory of other, unwanted touches rising in her throat. But his grip was firm and impersonal, a simple, physical act of assistance. He lifted her onto the seat as if she weighed nothing, then walked around to the other side and climbed up beside her. He didn't speak as he took up the reins and clicked his tongue. The mule, patient and stoic, began to move. They rolled through the main street of Redemption, past the glaring windows of Stallworth's mercantile, past the saloon where men watched them from the shade of the porch, past the pinched, judgmental faces of the women they passed. Alara kept her eyes fixed on her own lap, on her tightly clasped hands. The silence in the wagon was vast and heavy. It stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. Who was this man? Why had he done this? What did he want from her? Fear, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her numbness. She had just traded one unknown for another, perhaps a far more dangerous one. A public fool for a silent stranger. The town fell away behind them, replaced by a rolling landscape of dry grass and stubborn, sun-bleached rock. The sky was a huge, empty bowl of blue. There was nothing out here. No houses, no people, just the endless land and the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels. The silence grew louder, more intimidating. She felt she ought to say something, to thank him, but the words were a tangled knot in her throat. The fear of her own voice, of the inevitable, humiliating stumble, kept her mute. They rode like that for what felt like hours. The sun began to dip toward the jagged line of the western hills, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. Silas hadn't looked at her once. He just kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his profile carved and stoic against the vibrant sunset. She studied him from the corner of her eye. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps not yet 30. There were lines of weariness around his eyes, but not of cruelty. His stillness wasn't menacing, it was contained, as if he held all his words and thoughts deep inside, letting out only what was absolutely necessary. Finally, as the light began to fade, he pulled the mule to a halt. Need to rest the mule and eat. He got down and began to unhitch the animal, leading it to a sparse patch of grass. He moved with a practiced efficiency that spoke of a life lived in a repeating rhythm of necessary chores. Alara remained on the wagon seat, unsure of what to do, what was expected of her. He returned from tending the mule and looked up at her. You hungry? She managed a small nod. All right. He reached into one of the sacks and pulled out a block of cheese, a loaf of hard bread, and a canteen. He sliced the cheese and bread with a knife from his belt and handed a portion up to her. His movements were direct, without ceremony. It was the simple sharing of food, nothing more. She took it, her stomach growling in betrayal. "Th, thank you," she managed, the words catching only a little. He grunted in acknowledgement and sat on the ground with his back against a wagon wheel, eating his own share. They ate in silence as the last of the light bled from the sky and the first stars began to prick the deepening purple canvas above. The air grew cooler. The world shrank to the small circle of their wagon in the vast, empty wilderness. The quiet was different now. It wasn't the hostile silence of the town or the awkward silence of the initial wagon ride. It was the natural quiet of the world at rest. For the first time all day, Alara felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest loosen, just a fraction. Here, in the middle of nowhere, with this strange, quiet man, there were no expectations, no audience to perform for, no one to judge the broken cadence of her speech. When they had finished, he took her empty plate without a word and packed everything away. He looked at her, his face now mostly in shadow. You can sleep in the wagon bed. I'll take the ground. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. He was giving her the safer, more comfortable space. It was another small, unspoken act of decency. She slid from the seat into the back of the wagon, curling up on a pile of empty grain sacks. He laid out a bedroll on the far side of the wagon, a respectable distance away. "SS Silas?" she whispered into the darkness. She saw his shape stir. "Yeah, WHY." The question was a bare thread of sound, almost lost to the whisper of the night wind. He was quiet for a long moment. She thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low murmur, seeming to come from the earth itself. "No one ought to be treated like that," he said. "Stallworth. He's a man who likes to show off his property. He thinks everything has a price tag. Some things don't." He said nothing more. He rolled over, his back to her, and the conversation was over. Alara lay on the rough sacks, listening to the lonely cry of a coyote in the distance. Some things don't. The words echoed in the quiet emptiness of her heart. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow, or where this path was leading. But for the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her, not out of love or duty, but out of a simple, rugged principle. She closed her eyes, the hard floor of the wagon beneath her feeling more solid and secure than any ground she had ever stood on. The rest of the journey passed in a similar state of sparse words and shared quiet. They arrived at his ranch late the next day. It was not a grand place. A small, sturdy cabin made of rough-hewn logs stood in a dusty clearing, flanked by a modest barn and a series of corrals. The entire place was dwarfed by the immense, rugged landscape that surrounded it, a panorama of stark mesas and endless sky. It was isolated, lonely, and to Alara's eyes, beautiful. It felt like a sanctuary tucked away from the prying eyes of the world. Silas gave her a tour that consisted of pointing. Cabin. Barn. Well. Outhouse. He led her inside the cabin. It was one room, meticulously clean but Spartan. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding a few plates and tins. In one corner was a bed. In the other, a small cot. He gestured to the cot. That's yours. He set her valise down beside it. There's work to do, if you want to earn your keep. Tending the chickens, the garden, mending, cooking, simple things. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He was offering her a role, a purpose, not as a wife, not as an object of pity, but as a contributor, a partner in the simple, hard work of survival. I see he can do that, she said. Good, he put on his hat. I've got fences to check before dark. And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet cabin that was to be her new home. The days settled into a rhythm. Silas would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would be out for hours, tending his small herd of cattle, mending the endless miles of fence, doing the back-breaking work of a man trying to tame a piece of this unforgiving land. Alara, in turn, found her own domain. She collected eggs from the half-dozen fussy hens, weeded the vegetable garden with a ferocious determination, and patched Silas's worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Her greatest challenge, and her greatest solace, was the cooking. Silas's supplies were basic: flour, beans, salted pork, potatoes, but she found ways to transform them. She learned the quirks of the cast-iron stove, coaxing it to produce fluffy biscuits and savory stews. She discovered wild onions growing near the creek bed and added them to everything. Their meals were the one time of day they were consistently together, eating in their customary silence at the small table. But the silence was changing. It was no longer the tense, awkward quiet of strangers. It had become a comfortable space, a shared language. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders when he came in at dusk. A slight slump meant a fence was down or a calf was missing. A straight, easy posture meant a good day's work. He, in turn, learned to read her. He noticed she hummed when she was content, a low, tuneless sound she made when kneading dough. He saw the way she would gently stroke the mule's nose when she thought no one was watching. He never, ever pressured her to speak. If she needed to tell him something, that they were low on flour, or that a fox had been sniffing around the chicken coop, he would wait patiently, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder, giving her the space and time to get the words out. He never finished her sentences. He never looked away in impatience. He just waited, and because he waited, the words began to come a little easier. The terrible, suffocating panic that had been her lifelong companion when trying to speak began to recede, little by little. In the vast quiet of Silas's world, her own voice didn't seem so jarring, so flawed. One afternoon, she was down by the small, shallow creek that cut through a corner of his property, washing a bundle of his shirts. It was her favorite spot, a place of shade and peace, where cottonwood leaves whispered in the breeze. She was trying to scrub out a stubborn stain when she saw him approaching, leading his horse toward the water. He nodded a greeting and let the horse drink. He watched her for a moment as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. That's a bad one, he observed, gesturing to the stain. Why, yes, she said. She wanted to explain that it was grease from the wagon axle, that she'd tried boiling it, but it wouldn't budge. The sentence formed in her mind, long and complex, and she could feel the familiar traffic jam of words beginning to build in her throat. She started, her breath catching. It was such a simple thing, yet she couldn't say it. Tears of anger at her own failing pricked her eyes. She stopped, pressing her lips together, defeated. She expected him to walk away, to leave her to her struggle as everyone else in her life had always done. Instead, he hunkered down on the creek bank, not too close, and picked up a smooth, flat stone, skipping it across the water surface. Plink, plink, plunk. Don't rush it, he said, his voice as soft as the rustling leaves. He wasn't looking at her, but at the ripples spreading across the water. No need to. She looked at him, confused. He skipped another stone. You're talking, he clarified, still not looking at her directly. It reminded me of this creek. She blinked, certain she had misheard him. Reminded him of the creek? Her ugly, halting speech. He finally turned his head, his gaze gentle. See how the water moves? He said, pointing with the stone. It hits a rock, it stops. It pulls up a bit, then it finds a new way around it. It bubbles, tumbles. It makes its own kind of music, but it always gets where it's going. Always, he looked from the creek back to her. It's just finding its own way over the stones. It's a good sound, like a creek song. Alara stared at him, speechless for an entirely new reason. A creek song. No one had ever described her stutter as anything but a flaw, a failing, a broken thing. They had called her stupid, nervous, defective. They had laughed, mimicked, and pitted her. But no one, in all her 19 years, had ever called it beautiful. No one had ever called it song. A single tear, the one she had been holding back out of frustration, escaped and rolled down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of shame. It was something else entirely, something warm and bright and overwhelming. In that moment, sitting on a dusty creek bank with a quiet man who saw the world differently, she felt a fundamental shift inside her, a crack appearing in the thick wall of shame she had built around her heart. He saw the tear, and his expression clouded with concern, misinterpreting it. He immediately looked away, thinking he'd overstepped, that he'd embarrassed her. Sorry, he muttered, getting to his feet. Didn't mean nothing by it. And no, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Thank you. He glanced at her, surprised by the firmness in her tone. He saw the strange, bright look in her eyes and seemed to understand. He gave a short, almost shy nod, then turned and led his horse back toward the barn, leaving her alone with the sound of the water that now sounded to her own ears like a kind of music. She looked down at the shirt in her hands at the stubborn stain, and for the first time, she felt certain she could get it clean. She felt certain she could do anything. That conversation by the creek changed the air between them. The comfortable silence remained, but it was now laced with a new kind of intimacy, a shared secret. Alara found herself seeking out opportunities to speak to him, no longer dreading the potential for failure. She would tell him about the antics of the chickens, or point out a hawk circling high overhead, and though her words still tumbled and caught, the fear was gone. It was replaced by the echo of his own words, a creek song. She began to see the poetry in him, too, in the way he spoke to his horse in a low, soothing murmur, in the gentle way he'd splint the broken leg of a newborn calf, his large, rough hands astonishingly tender. He was a man who communicated not with eloquence, but with action, with a deep and abiding respect for the living things in his care. And she realized with a jolt that was both terrifying and exhilarating, was one of those living things. The first true test of their strange, fragile peace came a month later, when their supplies ran dangerously low. A trip to redemption was unavoidable. The thought of facing the town again, of seeing Abram Stallworth, sent a chill of pure dread through Alara. You don't have to come, Silas told her, seeing the look on her face as he hitched the mule to the buckboard. I can manage. Alara looked at the cabin, her sanctuary. It would be so easy to stay to hide. But then she thought of him facing the town's whispers alone, the whispers that would undoubtedly be about both of them. She thought of his quiet defense of her on that first day. She thought of the creek. She straightened her shoulders. "And no," she said, her resolve firm. I will see come." He studied her face for a moment, then gave a single, approving nod. "All right, then." The ride into town was thick with a tension that hadn't been there since their first journey. Alara wore her plainest dress and bonnet, hoping to be invisible. But as they rolled down the main street, she knew that was a fool's hope. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. They were a spectacle. The reclusive rancher and the rejected mail-order bride he'd inexplicably taken in. Silas pulled the wagon up in front of Stallworth's mercantile. It was the only place to get most of what they needed. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't do it. She couldn't go in there. As if reading her mind, Silas said, "Stay here. I'll be quick." He swung down from the wagon and disappeared inside, the bell over the door jingling his arrival. Alara kept her eyes fixed on the wooden dashboard of the wagon, trying to will herself into another place. But she could feel the stares of passers-by, like physical touches. She heard two women whispering loudly as they walked past. "That's her," one said, her voice dripping with sanctimonious pity. "The damaged one. Lord only knows what a man like Silas Blackwood wants with her. He's always been strange. Living in sin, I've no doubt," the other replied. "It's a disgrace. She's brought nothing but shame to this town." The words were like stones, each one finding its mark. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, her hands twisting in her lap. She felt as small and helpless as she had on that first day. The mercantile door jingled again, but it wasn't Silas who emerged. It was Abram Stallworth himself. He saw her sitting alone in the wagon, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He sauntered over, positioning himself so that anyone on the street could see and hear him. Well, he said, his voice oozing false concern. "If it isn't the little stuttering sparrow. Has your new keeper left you unguarded? I trust he's feeding you well. You look healthier than when you arrived." His eyes roamed over her in a way that made her skin crawl. She refused to look at him, keeping her gaze firmly forward. "No words for me today," he taunted. "Cat got your tongue? Or is it that you simply can't get them out?" He chuckled, a nasty, self-satisfied sound. "I did you a favor, you know. Sent you from my respectable establishment to a place more suited to you. A broken woman for a broken-down ranch. It fits." Just then, the door opened again, and Silas stepped out, his arms laden with sacks. He took in the scene in a single, cold glance. Stallworth preening by the wagon, the sick look on Alara's face. He said nothing. He walked to the back of the buckboard, loaded the supplies, then turned and walked directly up to Stallworth. He was a head taller than the merchant, and where Stallworth was fleshy, Silas was whipcord muscle and bone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet menace that radiated from him was more potent than any shout. "You got business with her, Abram?" he asked, his voice flat and dangerous. Stallworth's smug demeanor faltered. He took a half-step back. "I was just making conversation. Welcoming her to town. Your welcoming committee left a bad taste last time," Silas said, his eyes like chips of flint. "Her business is my business now, and my business with you is done." He took out a small pouch and tossed it onto the street at Stallworth's feet. It landed with a heavy clink of coins. "That's for the supplies. You can leave the change on the porch of the saloon. I don't want to step foot in your store again." He turned his back on the sputtering merchant, walked to the driver's seat, and climbed up beside Alara. He looked at her. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. He didn't say, "Are you all right?" or offer any words of comfort. He simply reached over and, in a gesture so unexpected it made her gasp, he gently tucked a stray strand of hair that had escaped her bonnet back into place. His calloused fingers brushed her temple for a fraction of a second. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, a silent message of protection and care that shouted louder than any of Stallworth's insults. He clicked the reins, and they pulled away, leaving Abram Stallworth standing foolishly in the street, staring at the pouch of money in the dust. As they rode out of town, Alara risked a glance at Silas. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, but the anger in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. A fierce, unwavering protectiveness. She did not feel shame anymore. She did not feel fear. Sitting beside him, feeling the phantom touch of his fingers on her temple, she felt defended. She felt valued. She was a stray he had collected, perhaps, but he was building a fence around her so strong that no predator could get through. The rhythm of their life on the ranch resumed, but the trip to town had changed its texture. A line had been drawn. They were no longer just a man and a woman living under the same roof out of necessity. They were a unit, an alliance against the judgment of the outside world. The shared experience of that ugly confrontation had forged a bond between them that was stronger than any spoken vow. Alara's confidence, nurtured by Silas's acceptance, began to bloom in earnest. She started to take more initiative around the small homestead. She found a patch of wild mint and started a small herb garden. She figured out a way to rig a scarecrow that actually kept the crows away from the corn. Each small success was a reclamation of her own competence. She was not damaged goods, she was capable. She was resourceful. One evening, a fierce thunderstorm rolled in, one of those violent prairie squalls that seemed to want to tear the world apart. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and rain lashed against the cabin in solid sheets. A bolt of lightning struck a tall pine on the ridge nearby, and the crack of thunder that followed was instantaneous and deafening. It shook the very foundations of the small cabin. A new sound joined the storm's fury, the terrified bleating of sheep. Silas had recently traded 2 steers for a small flock of 12 ewes, a gamble he hoped would pay off with wool and lambs come spring. They were in the small pasture behind the barn, and the storm was spooking them into a panic. "They'll break the fence," Silas yelled over the roar of the wind. He was already pulling on his oilskin slicker and grabbing a lantern. "They'll scatter in the hills. I'll never find them all. I am coming with you," Alara said, already reaching for her own worn shawl. "No, it's too dangerous. Stay here. They can't know my voice," she insisted. She had taken to talking to the sheep as she worked in the garden, and the skittish animals had grown accustomed to the soft, halting cadence of her speech. They didn't run from her like they did from Silas's deep baritone. "Ella, let me try." He hesitated for only a second, looking at the fierce determination in her eyes. He saw she wasn't asking for permission. He nodded, his expression grim. "Stay close." They plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at them, and the rain was blinding. The lantern cast a weak, dancing circle of light that was barely enough to see by. They could hear the sheep, a chorus of pure terror, and the splintering sound of a fence post giving way. They reached the pasture to find chaos. The sheep were a churning mass of panicked wool, running blindly back and forth along the broken fence line. A few had already slipped through and were heading for the open country. "We have to turn them back, toward the barn," Silas shouted, trying to get ahead of the flock. But his presence only made them more frantic. They shied away from him, their eyes wide with fear. "W8," Alara called out. She stood still in the heart of the storm, rain plastering her hair to her face, and closed her eyes for a moment. She took a deep breath and began to speak, not to Silas, but to the sheep. Hush now," she said, her voice quiet but carrying strangely in the wind. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. "JJ, just a BB bit of our rain. It's all right. CC, come on now. TH this way. SS safe and W warm." Her stutter was pronounced in the cold and her own fear, the words tumbling and catching, but there was a soothing, rhythmic quality to it. A song. The lead ewe, a grizzled old matriarch, stopped its frantic running and turned its head, its ears twitching. It looked at Alara, a still point in the swirling chaos. Alara continued to speak, her voice a low, gentle murmur, a current of calm in the river of panic. "It's JJ, just me. JJ, just Alara. CC, come on." To the BB barn, she took a slow step backward toward the open barn door. The lead ewe took a tentative step to follow her, then another. The rest of the flock, sensing the shift in their leader, quieted and began to turn, huddling together and moving slowly in Alara's wake. Silas stood frozen, watching in stunned disbelief. He had been trying to fight the storm, to force the animals with his own strength. Alara had simply absorbed it. She had used the one thing the world saw as her greatest weakness and turned it into a source of profound strength. She wasn't fighting the chaos. She was calming it with her own unique rhythm. Together, they guided the entire flock into the dry safety of the barn. Once the door was barred, the sheep settled almost immediately, their sides heaving but their panic gone. Alara leaned against the stall, soaked to the bone and shivering, but with a triumphant light in her eyes. Silas came and stood in front of her. The lantern light threw dancing shadows across his face. He reached out and brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek, his touch lingering this time. "You saved them," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd have lost half the flock. They just needed to hear a F-friendly SS sound," she whispered. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the shy, broken girl he had rescued from the train platform, but a woman of incredible resilience and quiet power. He saw the woman who faced down shame, who soothed panicked animals, who had brought a gentle order to his hard, lonely life. The feeling that had been growing in his chest for months, a feeling he had no name for, suddenly solidified into something sharp and clear. It was fear, the terrible, gut-wrenching fear of ever having to live without her. "Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He leaned in, and for a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. Her breath caught in her chest, a mix of terror and a longing so sharp it was painful. But he stopped, his forehead resting against hers for a single, charged second. "Let's get you inside before you catch your death." He wrapped his own dry slicker around her shivering shoulders and guided her back to the cabin. The storm still raged outside, but inside, by the warmth of the fire he quickly built up, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of unspoken feelings and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of a shared future. He had called her Stutter a creek song, but he was beginning to realize it was the heartbeat of his entire world. And the thought of that heart ever stopping or ever leaving was a silence he knew he could not bear. The weeks that followed the storm were filled with a palpable change. The unspoken thing between them was no longer a shy, questioning presence. It was a living entity that occupied the space in the cabin, sat with them at meals, and walked beside them as they did their chores. There was a new tenderness in Silas's gaze, a new hesitancy in his movements, as if he were afraid of shattering the precious, fragile thing they had built. For Alara, the fear of his rejection had been replaced by a different, more profound fear that this sanctuary he had created for her was only temporary. He had offered her a haven, not a home. He had been her protector, but he had never spoken of being her husband. The rumors from town, carried on the wind like bitter seeds, eventually found root even in their isolation. A neighboring rancher, a decent man named Jed, stopped by one afternoon to warn Silas. "Folks are talking, see," Jed said, shifting uncomfortably on his horse. "Stalwart's been making a stink, going on about morality and the town's reputation. He's been talking to the circuit judge, saying her arrangement ain't proper, that a fine, upstanding Christian town can't abide it." Silas's face went hard. "My arrangement is my business. I know that. You know that," Jed sighed. "But Stalwart's got folks riled up. He's making it sound like you're taking advantage of a helpless woman. He's talking like he's her champion now, trying to save her from you. He's petitioning the judge to have her removed from your care, to have her sent to an institution back east for folks with afflictions." Alara, who had been inside, listening by the open door, felt the blood drain from her face. An institution, a place for broken things to be locked away. It was a fate worse than any she could imagine. The fragile world she had built with Silas, this world of quiet acceptance and burgeoning love, was under threat of being utterly destroyed by the malice of a man whose pride she had wounded. After Jed left, a heavy, cold silence fell over the cabin. It was not their comfortable quiet, but a wall of fear. Alara looked at Silas, her heart breaking. He had done so much for her, risked his own reputation. She couldn't let him be dragged down, couldn't let Stallworth ruin him over her. I see Kinji go, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. IW won't let him hurt you. Silas, who had been staring into the cold fireplace, turned to her so fast it made her jump. His eyes were blazing. Go where? He demanded, his voice raw. Back to that. Back to him and his kind? No. He crossed the room in 2 strides and stood before her. He gripped her arms, his touch firm but not painful. This is your home, Elara. Do you understand me? Your home. It was the first time he had ever claimed it so baldly. It was the word she had been longing to hear, but it came at a moment of such peril that it felt more like a battle cry than a welcome. Be but the JJ judge, she stammered. Damn the judge, Silas growled. And damn Abram Stallworth. He paced the small room like a caged wolf. He's not doing this to save you. He's doing this because he can't stand that you're not miserable. He threw you away, and he can't stand that someone else saw your worth. He stopped and looked at her, his anger giving way to a desperate intensity. There's one way to stop him, one way to make it so no judge, no merchant, no one can ever touch you or tell you where to go. Elara looked at him, her heart pounding. She knew what he was going to say. We get married, he said, the words stark and simple in the quiet room. Properly, in the church. We make it official. Then you're my wife, and no one lays a hand on my wife. It wasn't a romantic proposal. There were no pretty words, no kneeling. It was a tactical plan, a strategic move in a war she hadn't asked for. And yet, beneath the grim necessity of it, she heard the truth of his heart. No one lays a hand on my wife. The fierce, possessive, protective core of his feelings for her laid bare. Tears welled in her eyes. As Silas, you don't have to tie yourself to me. To my problem. He stepped forward again and gently, so gently, wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Elara, he said, his voice softer now, all the anger gone, replaced by a deep and aching sincerity. It's not a problem. I told you. It's a song. He took a deep breath. And it's the only one I ever want to hear. Marry me, not just to stop Stallworth. Marry me because this cabin is too quiet when you're not in it. That was it. That was his declaration. As simple and honest as the man himself. It was more beautiful than any sonnet. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, tears streaming down her face now. Tears of terror and relief, and a joy so profound it stole her breath. He saw her answer in a slow, rare smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his stormy eyes and made them shine. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and she buried her face in his shirt, breathing in the scent of pine and dust and clean earth that was uniquely him. This was home. This was her sanctuary. And now they would fight for it together. The decision was made. Sunday they would ride into town. They would face the judge, the preacher, and Abram Stallworth. They would not hide. They would claim their life in front of the very people who sought to tear it apart. Sunday dawned bright and clear, the sky a deceptive, peaceful blue. Elara wore her best dress, a simple calico she had mended and pressed with care. Silas wore a clean shirt, his jaw set in a determined line. The ride to town was silent, but this time it was the charged silence of soldiers before battle. They were a united front. As they approached redemption, they could see that Jed's warning had been accurate. There was a crowd gathered in the street in front of the small wooden church. Abram Stallworth stood on the steps, dressed in his Sunday finest, looking smug and victorious. Beside him stood a portly, grim-faced man with a silver star pinned to his vest, the circuit judge, Judge Miller. When Silas and Elara pulled up, a hush fell over the crowd. Every eye was on them. Stallworth stepped forward, his voice ringing with false piety. Silas Blackwood, he boomed. Judge Miller is here to see that justice is done. We are here to liberate this poor, afflicted woman from your custody. She will be sent where she can receive proper care, away from this life of impropriety and sin you have forced upon her. Silas didn't even look at him. He swung down from the wagon and then turned to help Elara. He took her hand, his grip warm and steady, and helped her to the ground. He did not let go. Hand in hand, they walked toward the church steps, a silent, defiant couple moving through a sea of hostile stares. They stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the judge. "Judge Miller," Silas said, his voice clear and calm, carrying across the silent street. "My name is Silas Blackwood, and this is Miss Alara Johnston. We've come to see the preacher. We aim to be married." A gasp went through the crowd. Stallworth's face, which had been a mask of triumph, contorted in fury. "A trick," he sputtered. "A desperate ploy to cover your sin. Judge, you cannot allow this mockery." The judge looked down at the couple, his expression impassive. He was a man of the law, and the law was clear. "Is this true, Miss Johnston?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Is it your wish to marry this man?" This was it, her moment. All eyes were on her. She could feel Stallworth's malevolent gaze, feel the weight of the town's judgment. Her heart hammered. The old fear, the familiar panic, rose in her throat, threatening to choke her. She squeezed Silas's hand, and he squeezed back, a silent transfer of strength. She took a breath. She thought of a creek tumbling over stones. She looked directly at the judge, not flinching. Why, yes," she said. The word was quiet, but it was clear. Stallworth laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You see, she can barely speak a single word. She is clearly unwell, not of sound mind to make such a choice. She is being coerced." And then something inside Alara snapped. All the years of shame, of ridicule, of being told she was less than, coalesced into a single, bright point of pure, cold anger. She let go of Silas's hand and took a step forward, up onto the first step, placing herself between Stallworth and the world. She turned to face the crowd, to face her tormentor. I have a V voice," she began, the words fighting their way out. The crowd murmured, some smirking at her struggle. But she did not stop. It may not be a PP perfect V voice. It SD stumbles. It F false. B but it is mine. She looked directly at Stallworth, her eyes flashing. "Teased, man," she said, her voice growing stronger, more forceful with every difficult word. "A Babram st Stallworth, he heard only a F flaw. He saw only B broken goods to be re-returned." She turned and pointed to Silas, who watched her with an expression of fierce, profound pride. "And thdh this man, S. Silas B. Blackwood, he heard a P person. He gave me a RR refuge. He gave me RR respect. He had never once and made me F feel LS." Her gaze swept over the crowd, challenging them all. "YYUSC, a ST Stutter. He hears a SS song. WH which of these men do you think is the BB better judge of a P person's WW worth? The M man who W wants to L lock me away for B being imperfect? Or the M man who W wants to SD stand beside me, BB because of it?" A profound silence fell over the street. There were no more smirks, no more whispers. She had not just spoken. She had delivered a sermon. She had held up a mirror to their prejudice, and the reflection was ugly. She had exposed Stallworth not as her champion, but as a petty, cruel bully. The merchant's face was a mottled canvas of rage and humiliation. Judge Miller cleared his throat. His expression changed. He looked at Stallworth with open distaste. "The lady seems to be of perfectly sound mind to me," he declared, his voice booming. "In fact, she speaks with more sense than anyone I've heard today." He looked at Alara with a new respect. "Miss Johnston, if it is your wish to marry Mr. Blackwood, then, as far as the law is concerned, there is no impediment." Silas stepped up beside Alara and took her hand again, his heart swelling with a love so powerful it felt like it might burst from his chest. He looked at the stunned face of Abram Stallworth, and then at the preacher, who was hovering nervously in the church doorway. "Preacher," Silas said, his voice ringing with finality, "we're ready." They turned their backs on the crowd and walked up the steps into the cool, quiet darkness of the church. The town, and its judgment, was left behind them. They had faced the storm and won. The ceremony was short and simple. The preacher's words echoed in the empty nave, witnessed only by the dusty shafts of sunlight slanting through the windows. When the time came, Silas's "I do" was a low, firm rumble. Alara's, though it caught twice, was just as resolute. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Silas turned to her. He lifted her veil, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in them a whole world of promises that needed no words. He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, reverent kiss that sealed their bond, a silent vow of a lifetime of quiet understanding. They walked out of the church into the bright sunlight, husband and wife. The crowd had mostly dispersed. The few who remained watched them with a grudging respect. Abram Stallworth was gone, vanished back into the shadows of his store, his public humiliation complete. They climbed into the buckboard and began the journey home. The silence that fell between them now was the most peaceful they had ever known. It was the quiet of a battle won, of a harbor reached. It was the silence of home. As the ranch came into view, nestled in its valley, looking small and perfect under the vast sky, Alara turned to Silas. The words came without struggle, flowing as easily as the creek that ran through their land. "Thank you," she said softly, "for hearing me." Silas looked at her, his love for her shining unguarded in his eyes. He reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your voice, it's the prettiest sound on this whole ranch." He watched her as the last of the sun's rays caught the happy tears in her eyes, and he knew he hadn't just rescued a mail-order bride. He had found a missing part of his own soul. He had heard a song that only his heart could understand, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would spend the rest of his life listening to it. The wagon rolled on, carrying them toward the small cabin that was no longer just his, but there's a sanctuary built not of logs and stone, but of courage, acceptance, and a quiet, resilient love. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.